year was 1926. Calvin Coolidge was President of the United States. The NBC radio network opened with 24 stations. Tiptoe Through the Tulips with Me was the most popular song in the nation. It was the Roaring Twenties.
Thelma Margaret was heavy with child that October. The strings of her kitchen apron could barely tie around her anymore. And no wonder. On the morning of October 19th, Thelma Dickinson gave birth to the biggest baby ever to be born in the Crestline Hospital. 11 pounds, 8 ounces. And she named her extraordinary baby girl Dorothy Louise. It was a record-breaking start to life, and what an extraordinary life it turned out to be.
Oh, when you smiling, when you smiling, the whole world smiles with you, baby. Yes, when you.
In those days, a new mama was kept in the hospital for a week after giving birth. So Grandma Earlywine took the train from Bellefontaine to Crestline to lend a hand to her son-in-law, Leland, left to manage little Eunice and Richard while Thelma was recuperating. Eunie was only 3, and little Rich was barely out of diapers when Dorothy was born. Having 3 children in 3 years is a challenge, no matter how you look at it. Before little Dottie's first birthday, her mama had washed hundreds of diapers in a hand-cranked washing machine out on the porch, winter and summer, hanging them on the line to dry. But the stiff challenges of managing a busy household was mixed with blessings of love and kindness, and music. Dorothy grew up with music.
It was music that had brought her parents together in the first place. At 19, Thelma, earnest and sensitive, and already an accomplished musician, was hired to play the piano for a high tea given at the home of Mrs. Dickinson. Her son, Leland, tall and handsome and charming with the ladies, came to the tea out of deference to his mother, but was smitten as he watched the talented Thelma, her fingers flying over the keys of his mother's piano. He won the heart of this spirited woman, and they were forever in love. This was the home that Dorothy Louise had the good fortune of growing up in.
It was a lively household. Despite the dark depressions that sometimes clouded the days of their mama's life and the MS that affected their daddy, that house rang with singing and laughing and was often filled with friends like Pete and Mabel Maddie, who commenced to having children with such gusto that eventually they had 13 of them. It was the Maddie family who were involved in the Great Waffle Supper debacle, a story both families would retell with great amusement throughout the decades. And even Thelma had a good laugh at herself, remembering 15 hungry Maddies and 5 hungry Dickinsons sitting around their big kitchen table, staring at the shiny new waffle maker she so naively had set to the task of feeding such a crew. It made for a great story and was part of the fabric of friendship that bonded the two families forever.
Leland was a fine storyteller. At night, Eunie and Rich and little Dottie would scamper up around him, clamoring for his bedtime stories. He told them hair-raising adventures of Goldilocks, or Jack and the Beanstalk. Hitchity-hatchity up I go, hitchity-hatchity up I go, he chanted, his pajama-clad audience spellbound and wide-eyed as he spun his tales. After such thrilling stories, sleep seemed impossible. But as the three children were tucked into their beds, Thelma would begin to play. And soon, Dottie and the others were lulled to sleep by Thelma's personal renditions of favorite songs of the time. There was no printed music in front of her as she played. She simply closed her eyes and felt the keys, creating the perfect atmosphere to quietly invite Mr. Sandman into the room. Her performance would have brought cheers and applause in any concert hall in the county. But in this little home on Patterson Street, it brought sleep to her children.
Besides her mama and daddy, the two most important people in Dottie's world were her grandparents, Thurl and Daisy Mae Earlywine, who lived away over in Radnor, Ohio. On very exciting occasions, Thelma would pack up the children and take the train over to visit them there. The Earlywines ran the pasteurizing station for all the dairy farmers in the area. Daisy Mae was a short little lady and round and soft in all the right grandma places. Dottie adored her. Her grandma could make dinner rolls faster than anybody. Their pillowy goodness was legendary throughout the county.
Grandpa Earlywine, the family musician who passed down his gift to generations of offspring, was a band leader in the tradition of Tommy Dorsey, Duke Ellington, and himself a fine trombone player. Thelma joined him in rehearsals, playing the piano parts by ear, a legacy that would later spawn a host of musicians, singers, and songwriters. Little Dottie, as it turned out, would be chief among them. Grandpa suffered a stroke in his early 40s, so Grandma sold the cream station, managed her house, became Radnor's postmaster, and took care of Grandpa.
The year was 1938. The Fair Labor Standards Act was passed, setting the first minimum wage in the U.S. at 25 cents per hour. The most popular song in the nation was A Tisket a Tasket by Ella Fitzgerald.
How quickly the Dickinson children began growing up. As the oldest, Dottie's big sister, Eunice Jean, could be bossy, but comforting. She was beautiful and willowy, conscientious in school, and had a lovely soprano voice. Dottie, Eunice, and their mother often sang trios together in the long evenings. Her brother Rich was silly and smart. He'd act like a gorilla, his long arms dangling and making garbled ape sounds, embarrassing them to death in front of their friends. But no one could catch him in a game of Monopoly or Rummy, and he was the family scholar, born to succeed with minimum effort, or so it seemed to Dottie. She wasn't conscientious like Uni. She wasn't smart like Rich, and she didn't give a fig about success in school. She was social. Dottie gathered friends to her like bees to honey. People just naturally came around when Dottie showed up. Boyfriends, girlfriends, even the bums at the local bum camp enjoyed regaling her with thrilling stories and entertaining this lively slip of a girl. She seemed to befriend everyone, as open-hearted and warm-spirited as they come. School for Dottie was less about what was inside a book and much more about who was holding it. Yet her natural ability to learn just carried her along throughout those elementary school days. Her one real disaster, though, was learning the piano. She adored music, She was born into music, but little Dot hated practicing. And when she inevitably stumbled through that week's lesson, a sharp crack with a ruler on her fingers and frowns from her piano teacher was the result. Week after week it did not go well, and was soon given up to the relief of everyone. Conscientious Uni manfully struggled on, learning to read notes and play her pieces. Dottie did not. But Grandpa Earlywine's musical genes were still coursing through her veins. They popped out whenever she sang. She could hear every harmony any song needed. She might not know the chord's name, but she knew where it belonged, and without any notes in front of her. This gift of harmonies would flow through her to her children and grandchildren in decades to come. Dottie had an extraordinary ability to make friends. Her girlfriends came in a riotous rainbow of personalities and names. Christina, Doreen, Mary, and Jean, to name a few.
On the other hand, Dottie's boyfriends were unusually similar. They were all named Bob. Early on, there was Bob Newman, who walked clear across town on a crisp Christmas day to deliver a 5-pound box of chocolates to his girl. His head was probably full of happy expectations as he trudged along carrying that heavy, heart-shaped box. He was about to make some 12-year-old's day. But he hadn't counted on Dottie having received her first pair of real ice skates on Christmas morning. He couldn't know how she was imagining herself at that moment, an ice skating star, twirling to the cheer of the crowds as she skated down the frozen creek by her house. Her parents would be home. She waved in the right direction, and without a backward glance, she skated away from him on her path to glory, leaving him watching after her, holding the unopened box of chocolates.
A few years later, it was Bob Needles who got Dottie's attention. She was a sophomore cheerleader, and football Friday nights were brimming with pom-poms and team spirit. He'd come cruising in from Shelby, a motorcycle guy, a little on the wild side, but very handsome. She might have fallen a little for Bob Needles if the war hadn't come, but it did. And he went away to fight for our country, while Dottie went on learning new cheers and helping the football team of Crestline High fight for victory. She didn't know until years later that Bob Needles secretly hoped Dorothy Louise Dickinson would be waiting for him when he got back home after the war. But that was not to be.
There was yet another Bob. He came to her attention through the front door of a church. It all came about because of her saintly mother. Dot used to call her mother Little Jesus Woman. Whether a compliment or complaint isn't clear, but there's no doubt Thelma Margaret was a thoroughly earnest believer if ever there was one. So when someone rapped on their door one evening and offered to begin studying the Bible together, Thelma was enthusiastic. She was still suffering from deep depressions that kept her from attending a regular church. So the thought of spiritual teaching in the security of her own home was very appealing.
Every week, Charles and Ella French began coming to the Dickinson home. They arrived with Bibles and tracts filled with truths supported by scriptures, clear and compelling explanations of spiritual truths Thelma had never heard before. She went to her Bible after the Frenches left and reread and restudied everything they were saying. She began to question some of the fundamental beliefs of her Methodist upbringing. Leland was less than enthusiastic about these Bible studies. He wasn't indifferent to spiritual things, but he didn't get all the hoopla about worshiping on this day versus that day. Was it all that important to know if people went straight to heaven after they died or rested in the grave until resurrected? Still, he thoughtfully watched his wife, her face glowing with excitement for new Bible truth, and decided to follow her lead in these matters. He didn't particularly care one way or the other, but if this truth made her happy, then why not? His only real test of that resolve came when the new church insisted his wife remove her wedding ring. It was a worldly sign of dishonor, this wearing of jewelry, and must be put aside, declared the elders. Leland argued manfully against this reasoning. But when he looked at his wife's earnest face, so torn over her loyalty to God or to her husband, he relented. But he wouldn't watch as she pulled it from her finger and gently placed it in her jewelry box, tucked carefully inside her top dresser drawer. Now that was the hardest part for Leland.
Within months, Thelma and Leland Dickinson became as sheep gathered into a new fold. They left their Methodist ways and became Seventh-day Adventists. Wisely, they left their teenage children to make up their own minds in this important matter. Eunie crossed over first, but Rich and Dottie stoutly went up to their bedrooms whenever the Frenches came for Bible studies. And yet, something about the peace they read on their mother's face, something in the joy they saw there, also began to draw them into this new fold.
Some glad morning when this life is over,
So, one Saturday morning, Rich and Dottie Dickinson went along with Eunie and their parents to attend the Gallion Seventh-day Adventist Church. There, Dottie got her first glimpse of Charles and Ella French's youngest son, Bob. He was dark and handsome with a killer smile that lit him up. He was personable and had just enough charm to ease a young girl's nervousness when meeting a church full of new people. In fact, meeting Bob French made the thoughts of joining this new church, with all its peculiar ways, a little more attractive.
The Dickinson family plunged headlong into all the services and social events of this new congregation, and soon felt rather at home there. So when there was talk of being baptized, Dottie was ready to make her choice. Still, it was a trifle wicked of her to wish Bob French could see her bathing suit hiding beneath her baptismal gown as she stood in the sacred waters. She was just possibly more enamored with that boy watching her from the third row than piously grateful for her Savior. But, well, who could blame a 15-year-old for such thoughts? After all, she was social. Soon Dottie fell deeply and forever in love with Robert French. Richard found love with one of Dottie's pretty new friends, Florence. Eunice had met Delbert, and life entered a new chapter for the Dickinson family. New chapters were being written for the whole country, the whole world.
The year was 1941. Americans had fought through the Depression, the economy was recovering, and it looked to most like happy days were here again. The most popular song in the nation, Chattanooga Choo Choo by the Andrews Sisters. Three weeks later, the Japanese attacked our armed forces in Hawaii, Guam, and the Philippines. The world stood still in shock. Hitler's Germany and Mussolini's Italy declared war on the United States. Happy days were over. America was under attack.
While World War II was erupting, it was wreaking havoc on the personal lives of all being swept along. Its sobering drama made life very uncertain. Young lovers everywhere were rushing into pledges of lifelong commitment before life could be snatched away. And so Dottie Dickinson and Bob French decided they too would not be separated by war. It was certain that Bob would be drafted as soon as he turned 18, so they began to make plans. It was to be a secret, carefully but hurriedly put together. When Dottie told her daddy a lie that morning and avoided his searching eyes, she deeply regretted telling it, but excitedly boarded the train bound for Kentucky, eloping with her beloved Bob French. She was 16. He was 17. But they came back across the state line as man and wife. To face their family's disapproval, win their acceptance, and start their lives together for the 12 short months before Bob was drafted.
Dottie cried her eyes out watching him board the westbound train without her. Dozens of other newly inducted soldiers from Galleon and Crestline crowded the train, waving goodbye out the windows to their tearful wives and girlfriends. Dottie stood there watching him go. Barely 17, she unconsciously touched the folds of her skirt, under which a new baby was beginning to grow. Her heart ached saying goodbye to her husband, but her heart also thrilled with the delight of carrying his baby. She wanted a boy. She wanted to give Bob French a son and name him Robert French II. Little did this young girl realize that the boy she was sending off to war that day would never return. He would never come home again. Instead, a young man who had suffered the horrors of a battlefield would return. A man who discovered the intoxicating allure of wine and women, cards and dice. He would be the man who came home. His would be the arms she would rush into when they met again. But neither of them knew that then. This day they waved their love to each other until lost to sight.
Dottie moved back into her parents' home. So did Eunie when Bud was shipped out. The two sisters were together again, both pregnant with their first babies, and both surrounded by adoring prospective grandparents. Cousin Jim was born first. That baby was cooed and coddled, rocked and cuddled by 4 besotted grown-ups. 3 months later, little Robert French joined the happy household. From the time Dottie was just a tiny thing, she had always loved babies. By 10, she'd offered to care for the neighbors' babies and hoped people would mistake her for the infant's mother as she strolled proudly along. When she grew up, she wanted 4 babies, she decided. 4. And May 4th, 1944, brought Dottie the first of her babies her heart had always longed for. Her every joy and delight was bound up in that child.
One of the first memories I have of my mother is when she was opening the door of our car to pull me out of it after I had almost drowned myself by driving it right to the edge of our creek, which was at full flood stage. Cousin Jim and I had gotten into a heated discussion about whether or not I could drive our car or not. So to prove to him that he was wrong, I got the keys from where Dad had hung them on a nail in the kitchen closet. I had him get in the back seat and I got in the driver's seat. My little 3-year-old body wasn't big enough to reach the pedals and still see out over the top of the dashboard, but I was determined to prove Jimmy that I could in fact drive that car. Somehow, I managed to turn the key just the right way, push the push-button starter button just the right way, put it into the right gear, engage the clutch, and push the gas pedal hard enough to keep that old Cadillac from stalling, and we were off. As soon as we started moving, Jimmy bailed out. That big old tattletale went running up the street to Grandpa and Grandma Dickinson's house, yelling, Aunt Dot, Bobby's driving the car." Well, I laid a patch across the Patterson Street, barreled through the ditch on the other side, and then tore through the circular flower bed, and finally came to a stop at the edge of the creek. I don't know if I had enough presence of mind to turn the thing off, or if it stalled it, or if an angel stepped in and stopped it. But I do know that if I had gone just a few feet further, I would have certainly drowned. That's when I remembered Mom opening the passenger door and pulling me out. She had that look like a mama grizzly bear might have when she goes to rescue her cubs. I don't remember if I got spanked or not, but I have always known that my mama loves me, and she'd lay down her own life for me if she thought that she needed to. I love you, Mama.
Dottie longed to share this baby's charms with his handsome daddy. A few months later, she traveled to Missouri to be reunited with her beloved soldier boy and to proudly show him his new son. At first, they lived in one of the little shacks provided for Army families just outside the base camp. But eventually, they found rooms in the basement of the Kirklands, an Adventist couple who rented to soldier families. It was Dottie's way to make friends wherever life took her, and these kindly folks were no exception. She blessed them with her ready friendship, and they, in turn, took Dottie into their hearts as readily as their home. They clapped when Bobby took his first steps. They grinned at his baby jibber-jabbers. The Kirklands became family to Dottie that year. Without them, she would have felt so alone. She stayed with them until Bob's units were shipped overseas. She wept as she watched him leave, not knowing how long it would be before they met again. Then she packed up her toddler and herself and moved back to Crestline.
It seemed like years before she saw her husband again. But the war was finally over, and everyone's spirits were higher than a kite. She ran into his arms, trusting that the bad times were behind them now. She was pregnant within the year. Dottie desperately wanted a girl this time. She was thrilled with her son as ever, but she just must have a girl. And she was rewarded with as pink and sweet a child as ever there was. Kathleen Louise was born the 26th of January, 1948, and life was good.
Hey, Mama. The first memory that I have of you was when I was a little girl, about 3. We lived in that upstairs apartment above Grandma and Grandpa. I remember that Pat was just a little baby, and I decided to carry her down the steps. Only the steps were on the outside of our apartment, and you happened to be at the bottom of those steps talking with a neighbor. I remember holding her very tightly, sitting on my rump, and scooting step by step by step, and you were at the bottom talking me down the steps, step by step. And the guardian angels were watching us. That's my first memory. Love you.
Dot had married into a family that was vegetarian. She watched her mother-in-law, Ella, turn grains and peanut butter into roasts and loaves that replaced meats. Dot determined to raise her children as healthfully as possible. They'd be vegetarians too. She even learned to make pancakes without baking soda, salad dressings without vinegar, and allowed no pepper on the table, though she adored pepper. Also, no mustard, except you had to have mustard in deviled eggs, of course. Being a vegetarian and eating healthfully was an adventure, and she was enthusiastic about everything, except soy milk. That was just too horrid. It was a simple life. Dottie did the family laundry in an old wringer washer, hung rows of Kathy's diapers out on the line, and became excellent at starching the collars and cuffs of Bob's white shirts. They lived in a small little house near John Gear's store, around the corner from Grandma and Grandpa's house. They had good neighbors and plenty of friends. They attended the Gallion Church with all its picnics, potlucks, and church socials.
The year was 1949. America had won the Great War and was on the rebound. Congress sent aid to their European allies despite the Russians' blockade of Berlin. Freedom and democracy prevailed.
Crestline was a railroad town. Most of the soldiers who returned home there worked on the railroad. Bob, too, came home and worked on the railroad but hated that dirty work. His charming personality was much better suited for dealing with people than shoveling coal into a boiler. So he left their house one morning, dressed in a suit and tie, to drive to the Buick dealership. He became a car salesman, and he was good at it. Soon, Bob was driving a new car around town and stepping into his new role in the community. The years sped by. The French family had just moved around the corner into the second-story apartment above Thelma and Leland's home on Brown Street. It was there Kathy and Bobby got a new little sister. Patricia Jean was born to them on May 18th, 1951. She was nicknamed Pat Pat, was olive-skinned with lots of dark hair, and had her father's dancing brown eyes. They might have called her Papoose.
Mama, my earliest memory was when I disobeyed you and went down to the creek and got all scratched up with prickers and stickers running away from the garter snake, and came walking around with Kathy and Glenda back towards home, and saw you standing on our front porch watching us, booing, little rivulets of blood running down where we'd gotten so scratched up. And you knew we had been naughty children. And you didn't say a word to us. I thought you'd whip the tar out of us. But I guess you thought we'd been punished enough. And then, after you had applied mercurochrome, yikes, but still, it's what everybody used, you came and sat with us out on the front porch swing and just swang gently with us, and didn't scold at all. But you did tell us not to go back down to the creek when it was flood stage. I love you, Mama.
There was a long outside set of cement stairs to that apartment. 3-year-old Kathy heard little Pat-Pat crying and decided to carry her down those steps to find Mama. 12 feet below stood Dottie, heart almost stopping when she looked up and saw the two. She began talking in a quiet, controlled voice as she steadily climbed the stairs toward little Kathy, whose tender heart was bursting with motherliness for her new baby sister. Dottie reached the two in time.
1, 2, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock.
The year was 1955. The most popular song in the land was Rock Around the Clock by Bill Haley and the Comets. Babies were booming in America. The conflict in Korea was over. The racial conflicts in the land were coming to a close. As well, the Supreme Court declared that segregation in schools is unconstitutional.
Within a few years, the French family outgrew the upstairs apartment on Brown Street. Another baby was on the way. Dottie wanted a boy this time, as decidedly as she had wanted her third baby to be a girl. She had her heart set on having a boy. When she went into labor, she told Dr. Sawyer that if he delivered a boy, Dottie would name the baby after him. And so Theodore Allen, Theodore after his doctor, and Allen after his daddy, came into this world on May 21st, 1954. He was a chubby-cheeked, bouncing baby boy they called Teddy, Baby Bear, and sometimes Tedder. At last, Dottie had her 4 children.
One of my first memories of Mom was waking up early in the morning on Patterson Street and going down to her bedroom. She was always there, pulled me up from the floor, and laid me on her chest. She rubbed my back, and I would fall asleep again before she got up to get breakfast for the older guys and get them off to school. Those were tender hands. Other times I spent in that bed were for naps in the afternoon when my big brother and sisters were out in the backyard or down at the creek having a big time. But I was not allowed to go with them because I was too little. So one day I slyly lay there pretending to be asleep until I'd convinced her. A few minutes later I opened the back door and tried to sneak by her while she hung up the clothes. But I didn't get very far. Something about her instinct told her there was a good reason to turn around, and there I was, busted. A few minutes later, I learned that those tender hands could be pretty tough too. She whooped me pretty good and sent me back to bed. Lesson learned.
Dottie soon found herself raising those 4 children alone, with no child support. Yet while money was in such short supply, there was always large quantities of love and laughter in that busy home. Their house on Patterson Street had a large backyard where black raspberry bushes lined the fence on one side and currant bushes lined the other. A huge willow tree grew there. The children often wove little baskets out of its flexible branches. But some days Dottie was known to send naughty little children out to tear off one of its long, tender branches. The guilty child had to watch as she stripped off its leaves and turned it into a switch for stinging the legs of a wayward girl or boy. That tree was both friend and foe. And likewise, Dottie often had to play the role of mother and father. There was an apple tree in the yard where little green apples gave applesauce and apple dumplings in late summer. Little Teddy decided it was his time to climb up in the tree to pick some choice fruit. The trouble was, he climbed too far up to find his way back down. After much coaxing by Dottie and the other kids, Bobby climbed up, took Teddy in his arms, and jumped to the ground with him. Big brothers and sisters can be a curse or a blessing. Another exciting rescue is on record.
They always had a large garden where tomatoes and green beans grew. Pal was their constant companion, with tail wagging furiously whenever Bobby whistled for her company. Apache would come stick his big horsey head over the fence by the blackberries and whinny for some apple goodness. A little stream at the back of their property became a roaring, flooded torrent in the spring. Being the good mother she was, Dottie would forbid her children to go back there during flood stage. However, the allure of that rushing water would sometimes overpower her children's goodness, and down to the creek they would sneak. 4 guardian angels must have been busy during those spring rains, for none of those children ever drowned. The Imes family lived just across the street from the French family on the other side of Patterson Street. Jean Imes was a sweet, round little woman who managed things by yelling loudly at her 3 rowdy boys and 2 sweet daughters. She and Dottie were very good friends and neighbored often. During summer rains, she and Jean sometimes loaded all of their children onto black inner tubes. No life jackets, the babies not yet able to swim, they grasped the toes of the older children and hung on for dear life. The group would float from behind the French's house on a large creek flowing in the shape of a horseshoe and ended up behind the Imes' backyard. Whooping with victory, they'd all pick up their tubes, run back across the street to the French's backyard, and drop back into the stream to do it again. It was a wonderful way to spend a summer's day.
Another delight of a rainy summer day was when Dottie and Jean let their brood get into bathing suits and stood them under the downspouts where shampoo and rainwater left the long flowing hair of the girls all shiny and soft. It was glorious fun to feel rained on and soaped up, and wildly free to use all of nature's raindrops in such a gypsy fashion. Dottie trusted her older children to watch the younger ones, and they rambled down by the creek for hours and hours on a hot day in July. There were tumbles into and out of many scrapes, but no real harm was done, and a whole lot of freedom and fun was had. Her children were allowed to walk up to the corner grocery store to buy penny candy or a loaf of bread. She trusted her children to behave themselves and act responsibly, and, for the most part, they did. Of all the gifts of motherhood Dottie gave to her children, enthusiasm for life, the joy of music, and a love for God were the pillars upon which she built her family's lives. These 3 gifts transcended financial challenges, health issues, and many personal disappointments.
Dottie wasn't an uptight sort of person. Having a gaggle of 4 children ready for church by 9 a.m. on a Saturday morning didn't get her underwear in knots. There was a nice, friendly feeling when they all loaded up in the old Buick, dressed and combed, and set out for church. Now they attended Blooming Grove, a dear little country church complete with a tall white steeple and a sturdy outhouse in the back. Dottie and the children always sat together in a row on the long, hard pews. While the preacher preached, Dottie's fingers would rub the little ones' backs and play with their hair. Children were expected to keep themselves quietly entertained during a sermon, or at least quiet. There was good music in that church. lots of people could really sing. Dottie sang trios with her sister Eunice and Pastor Yakish. The two sisters died deaths of stage fright every single time, but stood up there looking cool as cucumbers and hid their fear behind smiling faces. Dottie couldn't abide it when the church pianist would allow the congregational singing to lag slower and slower. She would sometimes take it upon herself to speed everyone up, staring straight ahead, singing from her pew at a faster pace than everyone else. The rest of the congregation might still be singing "While the Dew is Still on the Roses," while she was belting out, "And the Voice I Hear." It made her children's eyes get bigger and bigger to see if this was all going to end in a musical train wreck. But they understood their mama was trying her best to remedy such sad, laggy singing, so they bore with it.
Just down the street from the church was the little two-room Adventist elementary school. Mr. Draper was the school's principal and also taught grades 5 through 8. Divided by a large accordion door, Miss Rafferty and the other young teachers came to instruct grades 1 through 4 in the adjoining room. A large coal stove clanked out the heat in winter, and opening the windows provided some cooling in warm months. 3 of Dottie's 4 children started school in that quaint little building. Her children came to school with skills. Evenings, Dottie would be in the kitchen trying to figure out how to pull together a supper from the meager food in her cupboards, while Bobby, the little scholar, would be in the living room instructing his ignorant younger siblings. They all loved playing school. Bobby, as teacher, made up all kinds of clever games using numbers or letters. While this gangly teacher sometimes required his students to rub his back or go get him drinks of water, they put up with his bossy ways for the fun they were all having. And Dottie was just steps away, smiling to herself over her children.
These were hard-working people. Money didn't come easy to any of them. But in the Blooming Grove Church, they had determined that Christian education was of such importance, they would sacrifice whatever was needed to give that education to their children. Their children's very souls were at stake, and Dottie was of the same mind. Next to keeping food on the table, her deepest concern was how to keep her children in church school.
The school board met, and knowing of Dottie's financial difficulties, decided to ask her to drive the old red school bus to help offset the price of tuition. She would load up her 4 early each morning, and they'd all bump along on the route that picked up the other children. They sang and laughed and chattered their way around the curving country roads. Dottie got them to school on time and wished them a good day as they left.
Then, abruptly, the Blooming Grove Church School closed. Pat had just finished first grade there when they learned the sad news. All summer long, Dottie scrambled to figure out what to do next. Oh, Lord, please send the tuition.
Okay.
But by September, there was still only enough in the budget to allow Bobby and Kathy to begin attending the Manette Adventist Church School. So it was that Pat learned her fate. She would have to be the sacrificial lamb. She was going to be sent to public school. It sent a shiver through the whole family. What would she be like if she spent a whole day associating with Presbyterian or Catholic children? And what if the atheists' children went there? It was a very solemn mama who dressed her little innocent girl and sent her to walk with the Imes children to the public school on the very first day. Dottie prayed and paced the whole day long. Then, Lord be praised, a phone call of deliverance came. Would Dottie consider driving the school bus again and extend her route to now go the extra miles to Manette? Would she? None of her children ever went to public school again. 2 days was as much as Dottie could stand of it.
Another Bob came into Dottie's life that year. He too was newly divorced and soon fell in love with Dottie's lively nature and delightful ways. Before she would agree to marry Bob Hart, though, she explained how important it was to have her children in Adventist schools. Would he promise to help her do this? Yes, he promised, and he faithfully did. How quickly life changed for all of them. Within 6 months, Dottie was remarried, the children had a stepfather, and Bob Hart was transferred to DESE, the Department of Electronics Supply Center in Dayton, Ohio. They had to move right away. Bobby wanted to stay and graduate from the 8th grade in Manette with all of his friends. Principal Stewart and his family wanted to keep him, please. To this, Dottie reluctantly agreed, but it was a decision she always regretted, and later so did Bobby. The rest of them left the Imes family and Patterson Street and Powell. They left Aunt Eunice and Uncle Bud and all their rowdy Steinhelfer cousins. They left their Grandma and Grandpa Dickinson, all their church family, and moved to the big city.
They lived in a subdivision on Bradbury Road where the houses were close together and all looked alike, separated by strong fences. But Dot and her family quickly made new friends of all their neighbors. Her children made tents out of old blankets closed-pinned onto their neighbors' strong fences. And it had been a good move. Immediately, Kathy and Pat were enrolled in DJA, Dayton Junior Academy, predecessor to Spring Valley Academy. They all found the Far Hills SDA Church a welcoming and wonderful church family. Every time the doors of that church were open for worship, Dottie and her brood were there. Every Vespers or Sabbath school, worship service or social gathering. It was a huge part of their lives. Bob Hart was not very comfortable with all of those new people. He'd occasionally take part in some service or other, but less often as the years passed. Dottie prayed and prayed for him to be baptized. Bob Hart loved that about her, but couldn't give up smoking and bowling. Those were SDA church no-nos. He felt unworthy to join the church.
The year was 1961. The most popular song in the nation was The Twist by Chubby Checker. The United States severed relations with Cuba, and John F. Kennedy was president.
And the years sped by. Bobby joined them in Dayton only on home leaves and in the summers. He caddied, carrying heavy bags of golf clubs around at a local golf course, and worked hard all school year to pay his way to Mount Vernon Academy. His grandfather, Charles French, had attended this Adventist high school, and his Uncle Dick was one of the teachers. Bobby sang in the ecoliers and learned to play the tuba in the band. On some occasions, the band or ecoliers would arrive on big buses to perform in Dayton, and Dottie and the other kids would come to clap and cheer, so proud of their Bobby. To help raise the tuition needed for the younger three in DJA and Bobby at the academy, Dottie found all kinds of ways to make money.
Dottie also took in washing and ironing. She'd turn the piano room next to the kitchen into a Chinese laundry, where lines of starched and ironed shirts hung, waiting to be delivered to her steady customers.
Her children helped with home chores, of course. The rule was, the minute you turned 6, you went on dish duty. No exceptions. Though, of course, by the time Teddy turned 6, his 2 older sisters were so capable of doing them that Dottie thought he would handle the more manly sort of chores, like emptying the trash. She let him take a pass on dishes, which made his sisters pretty darn mad. Tedder was adorable, however, and let them dress him up as a girl sometimes to fool their neighbors, which got them into all sorts of trouble, and they had to go apologize and agonize over their sins.
In an Adventist family, there were such a lot of ways a person could sin. Oh, there were all the usual ways, of course, like lying and stealing, but in addition, there were pages and pages of other serious sins. What you ate, or wore, or listened to, or watched, or read, all had sinful possibilities. It was a lot of guilt to keep up with. Dorothy Alleback was one of Dottie's good friends, and she had an even longer list of sin possibilities. Why, you weren't even supposed to have too much fun. But this wasn't the way Dottie saw life. Dottie intended that she and her family would have all the fun available, not crossing the line into sinful categories, of course.
There were family worships every Friday night. While Bob Hart went out bowling in one of his 6 leagues, Dottie and children would welcome in the Sabbath with singing and back rubs and lively games of queen and servant, where Kathy would trick little Ted into doing her every whim and then get very tired just when it was his turn to be treated royally. The children actually didn't mind not having TV on Sabbaths. 8 bells and all's well, First Mate Bob would announce on the radio. And the children would color and play Bible games in contentment until the Haven of Rest quartet would close with, I've anchored my soul in the haven of rest. Dottie would often fall asleep on the couch during the program, and the kids would ask her saucy questions to see if she would say funny things, nonsense things, which sent them into peals of laughter. When she finally woke up enough to send them to bed, they'd hear Unshackled, the radio drama on the perils of alcohol. And if they stayed awake long enough, the strains of Debussy's Intro to Night Sounds would waft upstairs and enter their dreams. Friday nights were warm and gentle.
By contrast, the next night was the time for a noisy party. There was Lawrence Welk, root beer floats, and popcorn every Saturday night of their lives. They had friends over to their house. There was much laughing and game playing, and sometimes Kathy would do the twist. She was such a natural dancer, it made everybody want to try it. And no one held back. Saturday nights were full of good fun. This was the life Dottie created for her children. If she could have had her way, it would have been a perfect world, but it wasn't and couldn't be. That would have to wait for that other world beyond the blue. So, while she couldn't give them a perfect world, she gave them instead these extraordinary things. Her enthusiasm for life, the joy of music, and a deep love and trust in God. These were the gifts she gave her children. And the older her children grew, the more they understood what treasure she had given them.
These gifts reached beyond her own family, too. Among Dottie's many friends was a group of ladies whose husbands also didn't attend church. They laughingly called themselves church widows. Jean Patrick, Eleanor Stout, Doris Roberts, and Dorothy Alaback, with Dottie, made a pact and a promise to pray fervently every day for each other, their husbands, and children. That pact was made over 50 years ago. 50 years. And through all those years, Dottie has kept that promise. She still keeps those women and their children in her prayers every day. Most of the ladies, all of the husbands, and some of their children have passed away, but for the others, Dottie still prays. This is the measure of her friendship. This is the measure of how fervently she brings people into her heart. Her love is not ordinary. It is extraordinary. And is it any wonder, 90 years ago, on October 19th, 1926, Thelma Margaret brought into this world a most extraordinary baby, the biggest baby in Crestline Hospital's history. And God looked down on that feisty, howling infant and smiled. Extraordinary? Indeed she would be. Indeed she is.
60 years ago, we were there on Patterson Street in this same chronologically age order
Yep.
of brothers and sisters. 60 years ago. And here we are. We still have each other.
I know.
It's amazing.
It is
It
amazing.
is amazing. We still have Mama.
And we still have
Mama.
you, Mom. And we're so delighted. And so we just wanted to reminisce a little bit and look you in the eye, in the camera's eye, and say,
Happy birthday!
Love you, Mama.
Love you
Love
to
you, Mom.
pieces.